Alrighty, let's turn on my microphone. Oh, battery's dead. Okay, good times. Okay, ooh, that's way louder than I thought. Okay, so, all right, a couple of very basic things. So, we're gonna finish up content for midterm 2 today. So we're talking youth in the labor market. We've got about 8 slides of content left. That may not even take us the entire class to do. Before I start, so obviously if you are wanting to come and see your first midterm, the next few days would be good. You can look on my kind of appointment booking. I think I put it on. I actually don't remember now if I added it to the Canvas page for this course. I think I did. If not, I will do that shortly. Okay, appointment booking right here. If you want to come and see, you can look at my available times and book an appointment with me. So, and I'm just one floor up, right? So I'm just like straight upstairs from where we are. Okay. I guess maybe I will go back to Canvas for half a second. I spent the good part of my Saturday creating practice questions for midterm 2. So the midterm 2 practice is up, and I will say there's almost as many questions in the practice bank as there are in the actual test bank that I'm using. So I created a lot of practice questions for you. So you can repeat it as many times as you want. I have it set to unlimited attempts. You can go through it over and over and over and over again. So have fun with that. And if you have any questions, let me know. Wednesday, I will take I think I wrote 8 short answer questions for the practice bank. So on Wednesday, we'll do Q&A. If you have any questions, you can, come and we'll do Q&A. And I will go through those 8 or as many of those 8 short answer questions as we have time for, to just kind of run through how to answer them. So everything after, like Wednesday's class is just review, and Q&A if you have any questions about the exam. But I'll say right off the bat, it's exactly the same format as last time, 30 multiple choice, 4 short answer questions with about the same expectation for length. Okay, let's go back. I think we ended off, yes, we went through this big pattern of employments thing, right, where we talked about the changes kind of from the 70s forward, how people used to start, if they were working class, in manufacturing, and then work their way, through the manufacturing system into higher and higher tiers of the industry. And if they're white collar workers, right, they tended to start in public service and then use that experience either to keep working in public service or to branch off into the private sector. Okay, good times. So we talk about youth, right? Youth work, really, the youth labor market is dominated by part-time work for obvious reasons, right? Because when we're talking about our 15 to 22, maybe even 23-year-olds, right, we expect they're going to be in school. So working full-time all year round is going to be relatively difficult, right? Some people do manage it, but it is difficult. Okay, typically, part-time work is low wage, right? You're more likely to be working around the minimum wage and high stress, especially because it is customer facing. You're the most likely to be in a customer facing position if you are in part-time work. And as we kind of move through, as we've moved into the service industry becoming more developed, one of the things that's happened is it's also become more rationalized, right? It's become more standardized as companies try to basically kind of, even from jobs where you're customer facing, where you're expected to do some degree of kind of emotional labor, right? Where you're meant to empathize with people, to smile at customers, to be understanding and all that. Increasingly, a lot of that has been pushed, towards standardized responses and things like carefully worded greetings. So I remember, because I think I've already told you, I worked here. My first job after my undergrad degree was a stint at Enterprise Rent-A-Car, and everything there was incredibly standardized, right? So the way that you answered the phone when someone would phone to inquire about a rental, right, there was a greeting that you had to say. You had to say, "Thanks for choosing Enterprise, the company that picks you up. This is Jeff," right? And I must have said that 100 million times in the less than 3 years I was there, because every time you picked up the phone, you had to say that. And trust me, if you got a secret shopper and you answered, "Enterprise Rent-A-Car, how may I help you?" You got your boss phoning you, the regional manager calling in. It's like, "I heard you didn't use the approved greeting." And it's like, oopsie doodle. Okay. So there's things like that. Customer service responses, right? I remember this as well because there was a couple of ways this happened at Enterprise Rent-A-Car. So every time that we picked up the phone, we had an acronym, right? So anytime we dealt with a customer, right? Someone was coming in, there were specific ways you were supposed to deal with them, right? Specific like scripts you were supposed to memorize and go through. And there was, I remember when we picked up the phone, they had an acronym for how you were supposed to, run through an inquiry about rental, and it was called SCRAP. And I can't remember, I've honestly, thank God, forgotten what CRAP were for. But I remember what S was, because it was the most traumatic. And it was start closing early. So like someone would call like, "Yeah, I'd like to inquire about some car rental rates." And I was like, "Great, let me start a reservation for you." And I can't tell you how little people liked that, because they're like, no, I just want to know how much it costs. Don't start a reservation for it. It's like, "Great, can I get your phone number and your name?" And because that was what the script demanded, we had to do that. I never did, because I was a bad employee of Enterprise Rent-A-Car. I was like, "Okay, yeah, here's the rates. Bye." I got secret shoppered a lot, and I did not do very well, which is probably why I was consistently passed up for Enterprise Rent-A-Car promotions, though I didn't really care, because I was not planning on making a career out of it anyway. Okay, so that kind of stuff, standardized ways of dealing with customers, ways of responding to customer service failures, right? And if you've ever phoned like the TELUS hotline, to get your cell phone service sorted out, or Bell or Rogers or whoever, right? And they have a script, right? And they're like, "Hey, this is my problem." They're like, "I'm so sorry that happened, sir." It's like, yeah. Fix it. I don't care if you're sorry or not. I know you're reading off a script. Can we skip the script and get to the part where you fix my problem? But no, they're not allowed to do that. And then here, and I'll say this is typical of the part of the labor market that employs a lot of young people. Schemes to get employees excited, right? And especially to build connections, right, with other workers, to build bonds. And a lot of workplaces, and this is true of like Starbucks, it's true of Enterprise Rent-A-Car, they try to have a youthful culture, right? They favor younger employees because they're a little bit easier to manipulate. But they like to do stuff like, things like company picnics, prizes, competitions. Oh my God, Enterprise Rent-A-Car had so many competitions. It was like, who can sell the most worthless car insurance? I never won that one. I was the worst. I'm not a good salesman because you have to believe in a product to sell it. And when people are like, "Is it worth it?" And you're like, I should say yes. I get paid extra and it's like, no, it's not worth it, because I just couldn't lie to customers. I liked my customers more than I liked the company I worked for, and apparently my own paycheck. So I was a really bad employee. I'm sure there's like a file somewhere at Enterprise Rent-A-Car about me and like how classically terrible I was. But you remember funny things from jobs that were traumatic. Like I still remember my employee number at Enterprise. was 733 CJ, and I don't know why, but I will probably never forget that. Probably because I had to type it into a computer 18,000 times a day for like literally everything. But yes, I was 73. I was just a number at Enterprise Rent-A-Car, 733 CJ. And you know, ask them about me if you ever rent a car there. Do you remember? Do you have a file on 733 CJ? They won't, but it's funny to talk about. Okay, now why do they try to get people excited and build these kind of fun, energetic youth cultures with competitions, Christmas parties? Enterprise did a month-end party where basically they would take all of their employees out to the bar and like basically pay for drinks for like 3 drinks and food for 3 hours on a company credit card. Again, it was this idea of building a youth culture. So on average, if you like the people you work with, you're likely to stay at a job longer. And they've done studies of this. How much longer? Somewhere between 6 and 9 months. And now you might be thinking, why does that matter? One of the things that a lot of workplaces at the kind of lower tier of the service industry deal with is a phenomenon called churn, right? Employee churn. Basically, you're constantly having people moving in and out of the workplace. Why? Because they're sucky jobs that pay little and they're super stressful. So people get tired and they exit these roles. So the more fun you're having, right, and the more you like your coworkers, the longer it takes you to quit, right? You're still going to quit this job eventually because very few people stay at, say, Enterprise Rent-A-Car and make a career out of it. But you're going to stay a little bit longer if you like the people you work with. So by creating this fun environment, right, and having people party together and form these really close social bonds, get drunk together, maybe sleep together, right? You create this kind of culture that actually holds people in the workplace somewhere between 6 and 9 months longer than they would otherwise. Okay. All right, so sexual harassment in the workplace. Okay, we'll talk about this quickly. So, harassment in the workplace, it happens to both male and female employees, though of course it is much more common for female employees to be harassed in the workplace. Something like this, unwanted attention. This is a little bit more rare. So we have laws governing sexual harassment, but it still occurs at a pretty high rate. So through their working lives, 87% of women will report some kind of sexual harassment, either by coworkers or by customers, right? And customer one, there's not a lot you can do about it from a legal perspective. The most typical pattern, right? So when we talk about what age women tend to be sexually harassed, it's about 15 to about 26. Right? The younger you are, the more likely you are to experience sexual harassment. And, what's the other one? Single women are much more likely to be harassed than women who are in a long-term relationship or married, right? So it follows certain structural patterns. Okay, we can talk about 2 types of sexual harassment. The first one is quid pro quo. And quid pro quo basically, is a Latin phrase that means like in exchange for or this for that, right? And in this case, quid pro quo sexual harassment is where someone makes sexual advances or asks for sexual favors in exchange for something, right? And typically it's hiring, right? I'll hire you if you sleep with me. I will fire you if you don't sleep with me, or you'll get that promotion or that pay raise if you sleep with me or whatever, right? Whatever it happens to be, right? That is quid pro quo. Do something for me and I'll do something for you. And it's super common. And I will say, okay, it was the early 2000s, so it was before like Me Too and stuff. But Enterprise Rent-A-Car, I will say, because it is, like Mos Eisley, a hive of scum and villainy, this kind of sexual harassment happened on a regular basis, and it was pretty out in the open. Some of the upper management, were very open about basically exploiting female employees in exchange for advancement, right? So it was, and I don't want to tell stories out of school, but we did have certain female employees who straight up admitted that they'd gotten the promotion by sleeping with one of the regional managers. So, there you go. All right, so that's quid pro quo. Poisoned work environment, sometimes referred to by other terms like a hostile or toxic work environment. Basically is any kind of work environment where the atmosphere is kind of toxic or poisoned, and especially when we're talking about, from a sexual perspective, from a sexual harassment perspective, anything that makes it kind of sexually charged or uncomfortable for another person. So this can be anything from like unwanted, like this guy, unwanted touch, right? Not making a direct advancement, but maybe someone's putting their hand on your shoulder and it makes you feel uncomfortable, right? Pet names, typically this is male employees calling a female employee sweetie, sugar, sweetheart, whatever it happens to be. It seems to be more tolerated from female employees for whatever reason. Pet names, are a different sort of thing. Sexual comments, sexual jokes, anything that makes people feel uncomfortable in the workplace for sexual reasons. That is a poison, toxic, or hostile work environment. Okay, and these last 2 points, often for women especially, work is sexualized. There's an expectation that women are going to dress, in a nice fashion, often provocatively, in a way that men find attractive. I have one friend, pretty high up at a small oil company now, but in her kind of early days, she was brought along to meetings with, I can't remember which company it was. I want to say it was BP, but I can't remember, or British Petroleum. And basically, she was brought along to this meeting. She was a junior level engineer, and she was told by her boss that she was being brought along because, the person they were meeting with really liked her, and could she dress really nice? Just because it would maybe help get the deal done. It was a really weird request, but these kinds of requests often happen, and there's an expectation, right, that women's dress is going to be nice in a way that men aren't expected to dress in the same way. All right, and then sometimes, and this is more true, I think, in the service industry, though it could happen in other spaces, sometimes women are actually hired, judged, where their attractiveness is judged as a quality for their hiring or advancement. And here I'll give you an example. I used to have a friend who worked at a restaurant called Moxie's. Now Moxie still exists, but I don't know if it's the same weird place that it used to be. They used to be known for their very attractive wait staff, especially women. Worked as kind of the busser, right? The person who puts you at your table. Also at that time, before we did online applications, people would come in and hand in like an application and a resume. And one of the things that they told her was that, if the person was kind of Moxie's level attractive, just hand the resume in. And if they were not as attractive, that they should write on the cover this 110. Now, why 110? Well, apparently it was because if you connect 110 with a diagonal line, it says the word no, right? This person is not attractive enough to work at Moxie's, right? So this happens, I think we all know there are certain restaurant chains that tend to prize, especially female employees, for their attractiveness. And this is the kind of thing that happens, right? You're not going to get hired if you're not in that kind of, I don't know, if you don't look a certain way. We'll put it that way. Okay. We got 5 slides, but there's some questions. I'm just going to double check how much I got left here to make sure I'm managing my time properly. Okay. 4 slides. I can do this. Okay, so workplace safety. I can do this one really quickly. Young people are the most likely to be injured on the job for a bunch of reasons. So, they're seldom unionized, which means they're sometimes asked to do things that are unsafe, and there's no one to back them up, right? There's no one to there's no recourse they have to say, actually, that's not part of my job description. When you're not unionized, you tend not to have as much power in the workplace. So for young people, a lot of the work is quite unskilled, right? It's not something that has required a lot of training or is very skilled. A lot of it is quite physical, and obviously physical work is going to lead to more injuries. All right, poor safety training due to high turnover. So a lot of, like, there's mandatory safety training in most jobs, right? Most jobs are going to have some kind of, if there's inherent risks, they have to provide adequate safety training. For young people, right, because you have high turnover, right, people come out of these jobs relatively quickly and move around, you do tend to have high turnover, which means companies want to spend as little time and energy on training as possible. So I'll give you just an example from my own life. My very first job was working as a restocker on a night shift in the summers at Safeway. And, you know, it's a pretty physical job. You're lifting a lot of big, heavy things. And before I did this, right, basically my safety training was to sit in a room at the back of the Safeway, and they put on a safety video that was 15 minutes long and was like, when you're lifting, lift with your knees. Don't lift with your back, lift with your knees, right? And it went on like this for like 15 minutes. If someone tries to rob you, just give them the money, right? It was like this all-purpose safety training video for everybody who worked at Safeway. Now, was it effective? Probably not. I had a lot of friends who worked there. At the same time, a lot of them ended up with back injuries because, you know, you're lifting really heavy things. Okay, we were all like 17, so we also thought we were invincible and did stupid stuff. But a lot of times, right, we just didn't know how to work. No one had shown us how to do anything. We were doing everything for the first time. There was very little supervision either. So, you know, even though we were supposed to be wearing like steel-toed shoes, a lot of guys were wearing runners and stuff fell on your feet and there's broken toes and all sorts of stuff, right? So this poor safety training played a role. Okay, the other one, and this is funny because I was talking about this in, I use a lot of these same slides in sociology of youth, and I had a student who's like, yeah, that happened to me. So youth work also tends to have a lot of what's called just-in-time working conditions that tend to be chaotic. So just-in-time is basically, how to put this? Basically, you respond to demand, basically using a concept called pull, right? So you produce things when there is demand, right? And that's called pull. We'll talk about just-in-time later in the course too. There's basically two ways of doing kind of, you know, producing things. Either you do it with, you know, pull logistics or push logistics. So push is basically where you would say, okay, we think you're going to need this at this time, so we're going to produce it ahead of time. What happens with push is there's always a little bit of surplus. You make a bunch of stuff that you end up not needing, or it sits on a shelf for a while. With pull, you basically respond to demand and you make things only when demand hits. So this is the basic principle of the fast food industry, right? So if you think of a McDonald's, we'll exclude Burger King because Burger King makes stuff in advance. It's gross. I can't understand why a Burger King opens ever, anywhere. But I think the 3 worst meals I've had in my life were all at Burger King. So, you know, why it exists, who can say? But let's think of your typical McDonald's, right? If you think of your typical McDonald's, they have a ton of data. They know a lot about how much food they need to produce, you know, and their typical lunch rush is going to start at about 11 and end at about 1:30. And they would be able to tell you with a fair bit of certainty because they have mountains of data for each location, right? That they are going to need, you know, X number of Big Macs per day. So in theory, they could produce, you know, 16 Big Macs in that period, you know, and they could roughly space it out knowing, and then it'd be ready when you roll up. But they don't. They don't start producing that Big Mac until you order it, right? Now, this is good for one thing. You don't end up with a lot of extra Big Macs at the end of the day that you have to throw away, right? So maybe that day you usually get 16 Big Macs, but you only had an order for 13, then you're out 3 Big Macs that you have to throw out. What it does though, and because this is just in time, right? You're producing the food just in time for the customer to consume it. It tends to lead to chaotic working conditions where in this period, things are extremely busy and there's people whipping around the kitchen, you know, making burgers, cooking fries, taking orders, you know, filling things, all that kind of stuff. So it's quite chaotic in that period, which tends to result in people not following safety protocols and, you know, getting injured as a result. And the number one injury for young people in the workplace, grease burns, right? Because technically, like when you're working that deep fryer, you should be wearing like a rubber apron and some kind of gloves to protect your hands because hot grease burns and it burns for a long time. And this was the injury that one of my students had. She has a big scar from his elbow to his wrist where he was working at McDonald's and got splashed with hot oil and it burned his skin quite badly to the point where he had to go to the hospital, right? So the more chaotic the conditions, and the chaotic conditions get more chaotic when you have pull logistics, the more likely you are to get injured. Okay. Or to pick up the pace if I'm going to get done. Obviously, right, because you're in retail, you're more subject to robberies, right? And often poor supervision, poor security, right, leads to more chance of robberies, especially when young people are working late at night in retail. This happens a lot in liquor stores, for example. And then young people are often blamed for their own problems, right? Well, he wasn't lifting with his knees, he was lifting with his back, rather than, you know, companies addressing the root causes of the problems. Okay, this one I can do pretty quickly. One of the other things that's happening in the youth job market, and especially at the base of the job market, is we have a phenomenon called educational inflation. And put kind of plainly, more people have degrees, especially BAs, right? Or bachelor's degree. Let's say bachelor's in general. Bachelor's of arts, bachelor's of science are the most common ones, but more people have bachelor's degrees. So what has happened to, like, the idea of inflation, right, is when you have more of something, like more money, you print more money, right? A government prints more Canadian dollars or American dollars, the value goes down and the cost of everything goes up. So basically the idea of educational inflation is as we've produced more people with bachelor's degrees, the value of the bachelor's degree has actually declined, right? So the bachelor's degree, which used to be a gateway into kind of really good paying jobs, is increasingly sort of the base credential, right? It's basically that credential that you need to get into the base of the labor market in a lot of cases. That used to be the high school diploma, but increasingly it's the bachelor's degree, right? And it's really common now for people to say, right, a master's degree is the new bachelor's degree, right? Because if you're going to get into that better tier of jobs, increasingly you need an MA or a master's degree of some kind. It's less true in some vocational professions like engineering, right? There's less benefit to say a master's degree or like a PhD. I know this is true in computer science as well. It's my brother-in-law's a computer programmer, and he's like, yeah, master's degree really doesn't get you ahead. And he works in the industry, so I take his word for it. And yeah, low-skilled jobs are increasingly demanding some kind of post-secondary. This was true at Enterprise Rent-A-Car. They had this very weird thing, and they were very proud of it. They're like, we don't hire anyone that doesn't have a post-secondary degree. And honestly, this was a job that a chimpanzee with relatively minimal training could probably have completed most days. And so I will never figure out why they did that and why they were so proud of it. But that was they're like, we need you to have a bachelor's degree. I was like, okay, whatever, guys. Okay. Now, credentialism, increasingly what we see is that education has become less of a good in and of itself, right? Something that people value because being educated is just good. And now what people value in terms of education is that it provides you with a credential, right? That thing that allows you to access that base layer of the labor market. Okay, so yeah, educational inflation means even relatively high levels of education have less value than they did in the past, right? So your, 16 years of education is not going to be as valuable, or I guess 17 if you count kindergarten, is not going to be as valuable as it was, say, for a baby boomer or someone like that. Okay. All right, long-term unemployment for youth is generally seen as a bad thing. And we know from a bunch of studies, and these studies come out of the UK, that we see what happens when people are unemployed for long periods of time when they're young, right? We see things like loss of wages, less happiness and job satisfaction, and depending on the length, worse health outcomes. And we see that both for mental health and heart health. Heart health, cardiovascular, tends to be affected quite seriously by long periods of unemployment. Okay, and what does this look like statistically? Well, 6 months unemployment at 22, right, when most people graduate from a degree, means an 8% decrease in wages at 23, so you make less money. And even 10 years on, wages are 2 to 3% lower. A year of unemployment at 22 can lead to up to 13 to 22% decrease in wages 20 years later, right? So by the time you hit your 40s, your wages can be somewhere between 13 and 20, so a fifth lower than they would have been otherwise. And the biggest effect is, the psychological effects of long-term unemployment. Okay, I think I got like one slide left, and then we'll be done. We might end early today. Maybe, or I can talk for 17 minutes. I'm perfectly capable of doing that. All right. You're like, no, please don't. All right, we'll see what we do. So the OECD. OECD is an interesting organization. It's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and it's basically a grouping of, the top capitalist democracies in the world. And the OECD was basically a group that was created to try and smooth out some, differences between these countries that are part of it, but also make recommendations for how they could improve their economies. So when it comes to youth, right, to our young people, maybe I'll change my color here, just so if I write on the red, you can see what I'm doing. They looked at the question of youth unemployment in 2005, and they came up with 4 recommendations, 4 things they think that national governments could do better that would allow young people to find better jobs and do better in the labor market long term. All right, number 1, they should develop and enhance youth job search assistance programs. Okay, now do you remember this? Hopefully you do, from human capital theory, right? Human capital theory, talked about a transparent labor market, where basically, the ideal is you could see all of the jobs that are available, in a particular field, and then find a job that matches your skills and interests. This is basically what the OECD was recommending with point 1. It's like job markets are often fragmented and chaotic, right? It could be that the job that you're looking for out of university is on, a company's website. They have posted it on their hiring or careers section of their website for that company, and the only way you're going to find it is if you know that it's there and you happen to wander onto that company's website and see it, because they haven't posted it anywhere else. So what the OECD recommended was that basically government should step in and create essentially a giant job bank, right, for young people, where they would gather all of the jobs that are kind of available at the entry level, especially, together in one place where it would be easily searchable, right? You could be like, hey, these are my skills, right? I'm a mechanical engineer. I have, 2 years of co-op experience. My specialization is in X. And it would search through all of the available jobs and come up with the jobs that match your skills and interests, right? So, developing a transparent labor market. Okay, point number 2. The governments should put in place temporary social safety net measures for youth. Okay, so what is this? It's essentially advocating for EI or something like EI out of school. So you graduate, right? You've got student loans to pay, or you have to pay your rent. There's no more student loans to fund your life. So what do you have to do, right? You have to go and get a job. And what the OECD found was that a lot of young people, because they just need a job, end up taking, the first job they get. The first thing, whether it fits their skills, interests, their training or not, right? Now, this becomes a bit of a trap. Because once you're in a job, it gets a lot harder to look for another job, right? Because the hours that you would typically interview for jobs, you're at work, you have less time to look for those jobs, all of those kinds of things. You get trapped often in lower skill jobs that don't match your skills and interests. I remember this happening to my sister, right? She graduated with an engineering degree, and she needed a job right out of university, so she went to work at Chapters, right? And she spent a year and a half at Chapters working almost full time, and had a really, really hard time landing that first engineering job, not because she hadn't done co-ops, not because she didn't have skills, because she actually just found she didn't have time to go and look for a job because she had a job, right? So she kind of got trapped. So what the OECD says is if you gave, someone coming out of university something like EI, right? A little bit of money, enough to pay their bills for somewhere between 6 months and a year, instead of falling into that first job trap, they could take their time, find a job that matches their skills and interests, right? Maybe do some job searching, some interview prep with a government agency that does that sort of thing. And instead of getting stuck here, they could get a great first job. So some kind of measure to bridge the gap between school and employment and give people a little bit of time to breathe. All right. Number 3, develop and enhance apprenticeship and other vocational education. This is basically, sort of a weird shot from the OECD at 2 types of degrees, the BA and the BSc. And what they sort of said in this report was that generalist degrees, right? So things like a Bachelor of Arts or a Bachelor of Science, while they are lovely, they don't have direct outputs into the market, right? So what do you do with a BA? If anyone can answer that, you should tell the Faculty of Arts because they don't have very good answers for it either. And same with a BSc, right? A generalist BSc, there's a lot of possibilities, but no specifics. So rather than push, universities and colleges pushing people into these generalist degrees, the idea is to push them into apprenticeships or other vocational education. Okay, so what's other vocational education? Let me just erase up here so I can write. So things like, engineering. Oops, that's a highlight or an eraser, highlighter, pen. Engineering, right? Law, accounting, teaching, nursing, medicine. Okay, so all of these, and there's lots of others, right? You can think of any of the trades as vocational training. Basically, rather than sticking you in a generalist path where there's no direct output, you try to tell people, go into something that has a specific career output. What are you going to do with this degree afterwards is pretty clear. And then you don't have as much of, these people being like, okay, I got my degree, I have the base credential, now what? Okay, my last point. How am I doing for time? I got 9 minutes. I'm going to finish. All right, so I'm going to go with my last point here. This one, number 4, develop special programs for the most disadvantaged youth that focus on technical and computer skills. And here, what they are talking about principally is what's called the digital divide. So your upper class and middle class youth tend to have better access to the types of equipment and software that they're going to need once they enter the workplace, right? So what the OECD says is for those people who don't, say, have a personal computer at home, and I know that sounds crazy, but when you get down to the working class and the poor, that still is pretty normal, right? There's still lots of people that if they're needing to write up a resume or do anything online, they have to go to, say, somewhere like the public library because they can't afford to have, a PC or a Mac or even a Chromebook at home because they're really expensive. So they don't develop certain skills over time, right? Like you're probably reasonably familiar with either Google, like Google's productivity software, right? Google Sheets, Docs, and all that stuff, or Microsoft, right? Office. You're probably reasonably familiar with a lot of what it does just because you've been using it for a relatively long time. What they're saying is those who are disadvantaged, right? Poor, working class, should get training that kind of levels the playing field. And I found this interesting because this was posted a few years ago from LinkedIn. I can't remember how LinkedIn is spelled, right? Lots of jobs get posted on LinkedIn. It's a weird kind of place. You want to know what's the number one thing that employers list on job qualifications that they're looking for? It's actually proficiency with Microsoft Office. That is the most commonly listed skill. So if you don't have proficiency with Microsoft Office, you're immediately at a disadvantage, and that's what that fourth point is basically meant to address. Allow people to kind of go into some kind of remedial training for, technical or computer skills that allows them to catch up on those points. All right. So why would an unemployed for 6 months at 22 mean smaller wages at 40 years old? Aren't those people looking for jobs at the time? Yes. Basically, it's losing that experience, right? So missing out on that experience and those early kind of first steps through the workplace, right? Those people who have been employed for 6 months longer than you are always 6 months ahead in terms of their hours, their experience, their development, and all of that, right? So it will tend to lead to that gap. It closes over time, it gets smaller, but it's still there, right? And the longer it goes, a year and a half, right, the worse that gap gets. Okay, how many questions on the midterm? Okay, I said this, but whatever, I will say. How many questions on the midterm? So 30 multiple choice, 4 short answer, just like the first one. Is the midterm harder than the first one? I wouldn't say so. I would say, if anything, the concepts are a little bit more straightforward. There's less theory, right? Less economics, less, market Marxists and all that fun stuff. So it's probably easy. I think, is the midterm really similar to the practice midterm? I think so. There might be a couple multiple choice questions that are a little bit harder, but I'd say substantively similar since I wrote the questions at the same time. So I was like one to here, one to here, one to here, one to here. So I think they're pretty substantively similar. All right, well, if there's nothing else, we'll do some review on Wednesday. We'll do a kind of open Q&A. I'll go through some practice, some of those short answer questions, and we'll go from there. Of course. Hang on, I'm going to shut my mic off so I don't echo in the room. Go for it.
So basically, I reviewed the chapter 6, and I see it says a lot of graph.
It says, sorry?
A lot of graph, like the chart plots.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm just wondering, do we have to remember
No.
the trend?
Just the trend is
the trend.
Yeah.
The increase and decrease.
Exactly.
But between.
I'm not going to ask you in 1958 what was unemployment. That's a completely unfair question, right?
Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Okay.